Hi, this is a video on the French advanced variation for black. It starts on e4, e6, d4, d5, and now e5 from white. Okay, so the idea of this move is that now white wants to gain space and play with c3, knight f3, and hang on to the d4 pawn. Once black plays moves like c5, knight c6, queen b6, attacking the d4 pawn. Okay, but black has this bad bishop, which is blocked in by these two central pawns, and therefore won't be able to come to f5 or g4. Okay, so there is lines where black can play in this line with b6 and then bishop to a6, where he wants to just swap off his bad bishop for white's good bishop. But these tend to go into more drawish sort of lines. Okay, so the main move is c5 and now c3. So the black wants to attack this d4 pawn whilst white wants to maintain this strong pawn chain. Okay, queen b6, knight to f3, and now there's bishop d7 or knight c6. Knight c6 is the main line. Once again, applying pressure to the d4 pawn. Bishop d7 is also a move, and after this, then the idea is that black wants to play bishop to b5 and swap off the bishop. So, for example, if bishop goes to d3, takes, bishop b5, white make castle, we take, queen takes, and now queen a6, offering trade of queens. Black just wants to try get a level position here, and most of these lines tend to end up in draws. Okay, so knight c6 is the main line, and we're going to look at this the main line in a minute of the advanced variation. First what I want to look at though is a side line. Okay, so what are some of the side lines that white can play? There's two moves here, knight f3 or queen to g4. I'm going to cover both of them. Okay, so after queen to g4, the idea of queen g4 is to apply pressure to the g7 pawn and then follow up with knight f3. Okay, so in these lines white doesn't mind losing his pawn d4, and the fact he just gambles it, he doesn't take it back, he just plays bishop d3, where black's pawn structure sort of limits him to attacking white. But after queen g4 there's a good variation that I found. After knight c6, it's now we're threatening to take with our knight, which white doesn't want to let us do. So knight comes to f3, so once again now if we take the pawn, then bishop d3 is what white wants, but now we can play queen a5 check. And it just ruins the whole white plan, because there's three white moves here. There's knight d2 blocking the check, there's bishop d2 blocking the check and attacking the queen, whereas c3 also blocking the check. The king moves, then white won't be able to castle, which he doesn't want either. His king's going to be stuck in the centre. Okay, so say if knight bd2, then we can just play knight to b4, and if bishop d3, then black's winning immediately after c4. Since we're attacking the bishop, once the bishop moves, we can play knight takes c2 check, winning the rook. For example, and even if a3, we can just take on d3, since pawn can't take on the pawn can't take the knight, since we just win the rook on a1. Okay, so bishop d3 would be a mistake here. So king d1 now is forced, and already black's achieved what he wants. Now the king won't be able to castle kingside, where it's going to be safe. So it's going to be stuck in the centre now. Black can further annoy white by playing queen a4, attacking the c2 pawn. And after bishop d3, we can just take on d3, whereas white can't take back because there's a pin on against the king. So if knight b3, blocking the capture of the c2 pawn, then c4 gives white a lot of problems, since we're just going to win a piece now, unless it's back to d2, but then we're just winning the c2 pawn, and if after a3 we could just take on b3 anyway, because after takes we win the rook. Okay, so b3 has to be played, and now to queen back to c6. It's also threatening ideas of playing c takes d4 and attacking the c pawn, c3, and now knight a6. And now we can see that black has achieved what he wants. So after bishop d3, bishop d7, it's making sure there's going to be no bishop pins against the king and queen. And now we're just going to follow up with moves like rook to c8 and apply a lot of pressure down the c file. For example, h4, takes, rook c8, and black is doing very well here. For example, we're threatening queen c3, winning a piece, so threatening the bishop and rook. So the bishop might come to b2, stopping that, but after knight b4, we can see the white has a lot of problems. Because after bishop b2, you can play queen c2 check. So after bishop b1, okay, you can immediately see that black must have an initiative. So now he can develop his knight, attacking the queen. And after the queen moves, then the bishop can come out, or knight can to f5. This is perfectly fine for black. You might even play knight c2. Okay, so this is why knight b d2 doesn't work. But I think against this line, this is why queen g4 is not very good, not very popular. Queen f5 check is very annoying. Okay, so after bishop d2 is queen b6, attacking the b pawn. White never wants to play b3 since it stops his ideas of playing knight d2 and knight b3. So after b3, black can just take on d4. We see that these dark squares are all very weak, so this bishop's going to be a monster once we defend our g7 pawn. Okay, now after bishop c3, just runs into trouble after just takes. And now we see that after bishop takes, there might be knight takes and winning a pawn on b2. And after knight takes, it'll be knight takes e5. So this is also very good for black. So the only other move is c3, but after this we can just take on d4. This c pawn can't recapture because it's a pin against the king. And after bishop to d3, then black can just take on c3, and after knight takes c3, black's just doing fine now because he's got rid of the double pawns which you'd normally have. So after knight e7, knight g6, which is a common idea, as it prevents white from capturing the g7 pawn, but also knight on g6 threatens to capture on e5. So after castles now, getting up the pin, now knight g6, black is doing very well, he's just a pawn up. Okay, so that's why his queen a5 check's a good idea. So we just delay the capture of the d4 pawn. Against knight f3, we do the same. We do a similar idea. So it's after knight c6, again delaying the capture of the d4 pawn. c3 just goes back into the main line. Bishop d3, we take. Castle. Knight to e7. Threaten to go knight g6, attack the e pawn, bishop f4, knight g6, now bishop can go to g3. So white's defends this pawn again. Bishop to d7. Okay, so bishop d7 is a move, but it's a bit passive. Queen b6 looks like a better idea, since we're immediately defending our pawn on d4 once more. Also attacking this b2 pawn, since the bishop's now on g3, and after like b3, then we could put bishop c5, and we're just going to remain a pawn up. And this is white's really weakened this position. And after knight bd2, we can either take on b2, or we can just play bishop to d7. Depends which way you like to play it more, safely or more aggressively. So after knight b3, you can play with a5 and kick the knight of a4. So once again, this is also very good for black. So we need to go into further detail about that line. So c3, queen b6, knight f3, knight c6. Okay, so now it's 3 moves for white. It's bishop b2, it's bishop to d3, and there's a3. Okay, so after a3, we're going to play knight h6. And notice the bishop won't be able to take on h6 because queen takes b2, and we are winning the rook or bishop. So let's say the bishop retreats and we win the rook. And if white tries to keep the rook, we can take the bishop. And now we are threatening to win more pawns. So it's going to be a win just a pawn up as well in that line, maybe even 2 pawns. That's why that's no good. So white plays b4, hence the idea of playing a3. But now he's take on d4, takes. Okay, a mistake would be takes on b4, because okay, c takes b4 just goes back into the other line, just transposes. But after a takes b4, black is no longer applying pressure against the d4 pawn, since the pawn on c3 is just going to be protecting against any knight f5 moves, and so black would need a pawn to break this down. So that's why c takes d4. Here is the best move. So after c takes d4, we play knight to f5. So now we're threatening to win the pawn on d4. So main move is bishop b2. Bishop b3 is also playable. It's not as good though, since black can play f6. So after takes, g takes f6, bishop d3. Knight takes e3, f takes e3, bishop h6. So attacking the e4 pawn, e3 pawn. That's queen e2. We can play bishop d7, castle, castle. Might make him to c3. Might play rook c8 and rook c1. So as we had threats of maybe take on d4 and winning the knight, and then we can stick the king on h8. So our king's perfectly safe. You can play moves like, if you need to defend the h pawn, we can play rook f7. We might be able to play rook g8 and attack the g2 pawn. We see this as a weakness, e3. We also might have possible ideas later on, winning a rook on c1 after maybe smashing open the position of e5. Obviously not now, because knight will take on d5 and win the queen. Not win the queen, but attack the queen. And so if queen came to h1, then this is a typical plan in this line. Bishop e8, and the bishop comes to g6 or h5. We're going to swap with our bad bishop for one of white's better pieces. Okay, so this is good for black. Okay, so bishop b2 is preferred. And now we can play bishop to d7. This is the better line. Bishop e7 is also playable. The idea is now to g4, we can play knight h4, but bishop d3 is the best move, since now black can't take, because takes, and this is check, and white wins the black queen. So on to bishop d3, a5 is played, bishop takes, e takes f5, knight c3. So we're attacking, white's attacking the e6 pawn, and after bishop e6, b5, a4. So we're stopping white from playing a4. White can't take on c6 because queen takes b2. And after, say, rook b2, defending the bishop, knight to a5. Say both sides of my castle, and then queen takes a4. Okay, so black's a pawn down, but he gets a lot of counterplay. His position tends to be fine. Okay, he's got the 2 bishops, and he has got double pawns. So you don't particularly want to be playing f6, since then your bishop would be under attack. Your bishop stands quite well on e6. So move immediately here would be knight c4. So it looks like a good move, just winning back the a pawn. We can play like rook c8. So this looks okay for black as well. I prefer bishop to d7. So bishop d7 here. Since now, okay, so now bishop d3 doesn't work. After bishop d3, now we can take on d4 since there's going to be no bishop b5 check again since the bishop's in the way. Okay, so after bishop d7, g4 has to be played. Removing the knight from the f5 square, but now we can play knight back to e7. Knight h6 isn't as good, just h3, and then we've got to spend time playing f6, knight f7 just to reroute the knight to a good square. So knight e7's good. Bishop d3, this is where white wants to be putting his bishop, and now we can play knight to a5. So the idea is white can't take on a5 because its queen takes b2, and we're going to come into c4. So say the bishop was just to move here, we just come to c4 immediately, and we see black's got a very good position after rook c8, and even after takes, we can just take, and bishop's come to c6. We have a wonderful diagonal. Knight can come to g6 or to f4, or it can come into d5. Black's position is tremendous. So after knight d2, his defend the pawn, rook c8. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better position. Okay, so knight d2 is a regular reply. The idea is defending against a c4 move, knight c4 move. Rook comes to c8. So once again, we're now preparing to play knight c4. Rook may come to b1. Now white's defending the bishop. Okay, now we can play knight c4, and so after bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e4, preparing to come knight to d6. We can play knight d5, and so after so we're stopping knight coming to d6 with the bishop. And also maybe threatening to play c3. So say rook c1. And immediately a5 is just going to be killing white. So say after bishop to c3, then black is doing extremely well here. And I'll probably play queen to a6 with the idea, okay, we're threatening the pawn on a3, and if white defends, we're going to play bishop c6, and there's going to be a lot of tactics on this diagonal, and that bishop's going to be a tremendous piece. Okay, so this is also fine for black. Okay, so that's the a3 line pretty done. We're now going to look at bishop d3. So this is commonly this is a gambit sort of line, where after take, bishop to d7. Okay, so once again, if we take on d4, there's this takes, bishop b5 check. So always be careful when you think you're winning a pawn on d4. Just make sure there's going to be no bishop b5 check ideas. This is sort of known as a poison pawn, the d4 pawn. So always play bishop d7 if you think about playing knight takes, winning a pawn on d4, unless you're totally sure it doesn't lose. Okay, so bishop d7. Now black is threatened to take on d4, so castle. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, knight c3, and this is the Barry Milner gambit. Okay, there's two ways of black playing. After this knight c3 move, white's threatening knight b5, which is going to be very unpleasant for black. So black can either play queen takes e5 or a6 here. After queen takes c5, this is not as good because white gets a lot of counterplay. After rook e1, queen b8 is the best move. Allowing knight takes d5, bishop d6, but white tends to get a lot of play. So after queen g4 or queen f3, it's pretty dangerous, even though black's only a pawn up. I think a better way for black to play is just with a6, very simply, stops knight b5, and let's say, okay, so queen e2, defending the e pawn, and now black's got a simple idea, knight e7, the idea of bringing knight to c6, white wants to play bishop e3, but he's going to lose the e pawn, so he wants to play f4 to defend the e pawn, but the f pawn's pinned, so he plays king h1, knight to c6, f4, so now they've defended the pawn, and now they want to play the bishop to e3, but now we play bishop c5 just in time. And although the queen does look a bit short of squares on d4, as it's completely fine for black. Don't worry, the queen's not going to be lost. If it does come to that, you can play queen b4 and then back to b6 and escape. Okay, so I took bishop c5. This bishop e3 move can't be played. And after rook f1, this is rook f3 even. Now the idea of bishop e3, then it's just queen g1 checkmate. So, and there's rook e1. Same idea of playing bishop to e3, but notice how this time round, after the bishop comes to e3, whilst once the queen takes, we're going to say I'll show you. So after knight b4, we're having to take on d3, and after bishop e3, then everything can just come off, and it's always going to be this d4 idea at the end, winning a piece. Okay, and so white's going to play like bishop back to b1, and black's doing extremely well here. Okay, so this is why this line isn't played as much. Black's found the resources to get a good position against this line. Okay, so another common move might be bishop e2. This is also played a lot. Okay, so the idea of bishop e2 is that white wants to develop his bishop, also not get in the way of the queen defending a d4 pawn. Also a3 sort of weakens white's position, so bishop e2 makes sense. And now we have to take on d4 first. After knight h6, white can actually play bishop takes h6, because after queen takes b2, bishop e3, queen takes a1, there's queen c2 moves, but the queen often gets stuck on a1 after, say, castle, and then like knight moves, and then the queen's going to be under attack. So that's why we take on d4 first, and after takes on d4, now you can play knight h6. Knight h6 now. Okay. Bishop takes h6, we can just play queen takes b2, and say after bishop b3 and take, and queen here, there's just going to be checks, and white's never going to win the queen here since we forced this exchange, and knight can also come to b4 and some lines of bishop d2, d7, so black can easily escape. Okay, so against knight h6, knight c3 is the best move. Knight to f5, knight to a4, so a way to defend the pawn. So that's a check. Bishop to d2, bishop to b4, and bishop to c3. It's all theory. b5, a3, and now bishop takes c3 check. Knight comes back and takes on c3. So now white's attacking the b5 pawn, so we play b4. So white takes, queen now takes, and then bishop b5 can be played bishop d7. And okay, white now tends to just get rid of this knight, so he doesn't lose the d4 pawn, and just plays a queen d2, defend the b2 pawn, where black can just castle, and this position is pretty much equal. Okay, so black does have the bishop at the moment, but you don't really have to worry about it being a bad bishop since it's already developed and it's ready to come to b5 and be annoying. Black's also going to be prepared to play those rooks on c and b file. So yeah, those positions are roughly equal. I mean, it's hard for white. This black knight always stands on a good square. The only way for white to get rid of it is playing g4. But after g4, seriously weakens black's safety of the king when the king comes to when he castles. But after knight e7, it's sort of doing black a favour even, because after knight g6, we might be able to hop into f4 or h4 depending on if the queen or knight moves. So yeah, that's pretty much that line. There are other ways of trying to play for white. So, okay, so say if knight e7, I don't think this is as good because now white can play knight to a3, since the bishop won't be able to take on a3, and after knight f5, just knight back to c2, and white comfortably defends the d4 pawn and has ideas of playing g4 next. Yeah, so I'd avoid that. So knight h6 is the better idea. Now, okay, so after knight a3, we can just take on a3, and this just leads to very bad pawns for white. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything covered in the advanced variation of the French. Okay, so I've gone over all the main lines, or just the variations I think are the better ones for black. What I would say is, actually, after this bishop d3 move, in this case it's knight c6, bishop d3, and now we take. Okay, so if you play bishop d7, this is why it's not very good. You may think, okay, transpose after castles and we can take on d4. Okay, this is transposition, but white now often takes on c5. So now the bishop takes c5, castle. b4 is going to be an annoying threat. So say after like knight h6, and actually bishop can take on h6. So and after knight e7, then b4, and so I don't know, bishop puts back to e7, b4, and black finds it very hard to develop in these sort of lines. a5, if a5, then b5, and after knight a7, a4, and black's position gets very cramped, and especially after bishop e3 and bishop into d4. Black's not really getting anything in these lines, so just be careful. Just make sure you take this and then taking up bishop d7, and then you'll be fine. Just don't let black take on c5 in this line. Okay, so that's everything I need to say on the advanced variation of the French. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will be doing the next one, next French variation line.